Hey everyone, U.S. immigration lawyer Michael Ashoori here, and in today's video, I want to mix a story with a case study. And this is regarding one of our clients that applied for his EB5 visa. The EB5 visa is an immigrant investor visa where somebody can invest in a U.S. business, create jobs for U.S. workers, and based on that investment and that job creation, they can get a green card for themselves, their spouse, and their unmarried children that are under 21 years old. Our client in this particular story was in the United States on an E2 visa. The E2 visa is also an investor visa, but it's a non-immigrant investor visa, so it doesn't directly lead to a green card. So he wanted to convert his non-immigrant visa, his E2 visa, to a green card by pursuing an EB5 visa. And so he reached out to us to see what we could do for him. And I want to mention that our client was very eager to move forward. But unfortunately, in the beginning, as we were strategizing his case, we were encountering difficulties on how we could ultimately make this scenario work. And the reason is our client owned a printer store. He basically sold high-end commercial printers, those kind of big printers that you'll see in an office suite. And his business originally started out with an initial investment that was relatively small compared to EB5 standards. I think he invested somewhere around $100,000 to originally get his E2 investor visa approved. Another fact that you should know was our client operated his business as a sole proprietorship. So he didn't have a separate legal entity that owned his business, like an LLC or a corporation. He didn't have a separate legal entity set up. He basically operated the business as a sole proprietorship, meaning that he essentially operated the business as himself. And he invested approximately $100,000 and he got some inventory and got started in his business. And over the next several years, the business generated a lot of revenue and the business grew substantially. So he reached out to us and he had very little cash. He didn't have cash to invest. He just had this business with all these assets in the form of printers that he now has in his shop. He basically had all this inventory, but he didn't have any cash to invest. And at the time, the minimum amount to qualify for EB5, I believe it was still $500,000. At the time, there were rumors that the EB5 investment amount was going to increase, which it ultimately ended up increasing, but he wanted to lock himself in to the lower investment amount of $500,000. So far, we have $100,000 accounted for, which is that original $100,000 that he invested to get the E2 visa. But since then, there was no additional new money being invested into the business, meaning him taking personal funds and depositing them into the business's operating account. Instead, what we had was a situation where his business kept on generating revenue and he would take that revenue and buy more printers and buy more inventory and do those various activities. But the issue was that act of basically taking the revenue generated by the business and using it to acquire more inventory, it can be seen as retained earnings. It can basically be seen as not being an investment for purposes of EB5. At the time he was our potential client, he was so interested in moving forward with EB5, but the issue was that so far we could only account for $100,000 worth of investment and all this inventory. But again, all this inventory was just him using the revenue of the business to acquire more inventory. So we were wondering, what could we do to basically reclassify these assets and do our best to basically distinguish these assets from being considered retained earnings? And we were working on a way of figuring out how we could reclassify this so that these assets were not retained earnings, but were instead investment made on behalf of our client, the investor. So he was operating the business as a sole proprietor. So we were thinking, how could we do this? What could we do? And I really thought deeply about this. And it was because our client was so motivated to move forward. There were times when I really didn't necessarily know how we could make this work, but our client's persistence, his desire to find any sort of way, really motivated us to really think long and hard about how we could make this work. And what we came up with was that we would basically set up a new company. So we would go from him operating as a sole proprietorship and we would basically set up an entirely new legal entity, an LLC, which is a limited liability company. And what we would do is we would transfer all these assets that were owned by him directly, basically, because he was operating as a sole proprietorship. And we would take all of these assets in the form of these printers and we would transfer them from him personally to this new LLC that we set up. And we would consider that transfer of those assets that he owned personally and that transfer into the new LLC as an investment for purposes of EB5. And we would consider that new LLC that we created as the new commercial enterprise for EB5 purposes. We're not out of the woods yet because, as I mentioned, our client was in the United States on an E2 visa, and his E2 visa was specifically approved for his sole proprietorship. So if we were going to basically transfer all these assets from the sole proprietorship to this new LLC that was essentially operating the same business, we had to amend his E2. So the first thing we did was we filed an amendment for his E2. So we basically notified USCIS that our client was going from operating the E2 as a sole proprietorship to a limited liability company, an LLC. So that was the first step. And after we filed that, we got the approval for that. So now USCIS was aware that he was operating this printer store as an LLC. Now the next step was basically classifying the investment. And what we did was we took all those purchase orders for the inventory. Now we had actual dollar values associated with all of this inventory. And we demonstrated that all of that inventory was owned by him personally. And he then took that inventory and transferred it to the ownership of the LLC. And so now what we have is an investment of capital. So for EB5, you don't necessarily have to invest cash. You can also invest capital, which can be in the form of equipment, inventory, and other such things. So basically, we showed that our client made an investment of capital in the form of inventory, which was these printers. And because we were able to classify those printers as an investment, our client had more than enough investment to show. And long story short, EB5 cases take forever to process. At the time, I believe that when we filed his case, the processing time was somewhere around 18 months. That's a really long time to wait around. But fortunately, the good news is, long story short, after waiting months and months and months, we came to learn that his Form I-526 was approved. Now, just to give you some background on the EB5 process, at the time that we filed his case, the way that it worked was that you first file a Form I-526. The Form I-526 is basically your immigrant petition, which demonstrates how you satisfy all the EB5 requirements. It shows that you made an investment, that you provide a business plan that shows how you're going to be creating jobs, and you basically have all this documentation in the Form I-526. It's basically your proof that you're submitting to USCIS that you satisfy all the EB5 requirements. Throughout the process, the Form I-526 is one of the most challenging parts of the EB5 process. So ultimately, after months and months of waiting, the good news is that the Form I-526 was approved. There's still more steps to take, but that initial hurdle has been overcome, which is very exciting. We're very, very happy for our client. He is absolutely thrilled. And the reason why I wanted to share this video with you and to share this story with you is to show you that sometimes situations that seem like there is no solution, with some creative thinking and a will and a drive to move forward, you can find a solution to work around these situations. And fortunately, that was what took place in this particular case, and we're very thrilled for our client. Let me know what you think about this video. Let me know what you think about this story. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to put them in the comments below. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next video.